Dr. Alex here, and welcome to number 2 in the best sword-fighting films of all time. Again, many apologies for the mid-season break, if you will, in the series. There have been many reasons for this. Varied, some good, some bad. With regards to the bad, I was somewhat demoralized after TF1, the French film company, which seems to harbor a desire to equal CBS in terms of its behavior towards reviewers and commentators on YouTube, had repeatedly attempted to block my last sword-fighting films effort. It left something of a bad taste in the mouth, and I didn't really feel like going straight back to doing another sword-fighting film. On the plus side, I was distracted by many other projects which were interesting and of varying levels of seriousness, including various silly musical ones, the Hitchhiker's audiobook transcription series I've been doing, and of course the latest The Doctor Reads the Doctor by the Doctor episodes and the blooper reel associated with that, which is of course immense fun to make. In addition, I had holidays and various work-based trips that I had to go on, which again took time away from my ability to upload and create new videos. But enough about the delays. I can keep you in suspense no longer. It's even more unfair because of this. And so, without further ado, and no more prevarication, and absolutely no more delay, I can hold it back no longer. It is the film which made number 2 in the list is The Prisoner of Zenda, the 1952 version. At this point I do need to make the distinction of the 1952 version because there is a 1937 version, and this is even more relevant because the 1952 version is essentially a shot-for-shot remake of the 1937 one, but instead of black and white, this time in colour. Quite why it was decided, with a mere 15-year gap between films, to remake the film entirely again, albeit this time in colour, I'm not entirely sure of what the underlying motivations were, whether it was some sort of cost-saving effort, budgetary constraints. The music is the same, it's the same score, it is virtually the same script, although they did polish the script between 1937 and 1952, and I think improve it. I'll come on to why I chose the 52 over the 37 version in more detail shortly, but the polishing of the script is one of those that I'll mention now. And I'll also mention now briefly that just because the 52 version is in colour and the 37 one's in black and white is not the reason I picked the 1952 one. I have no aversion to black and white films. As anyone who has watched this series knows, there are several black and white films in the series already. Both films, being identical virtually, have only one fight scene. Well, 2 at a cheeky push, which I have basically done just to flesh out the fight scene a bit more. So there is a little fight scene, then a big fight scene. But basically there are very few fight scenes, is the point I'm trying to put across, particularly in comparison to the last film I reviewed, which was Le Bossu, which was jam-packed with fights from end to end. Consequently, I can spend a little bit more time talking about the film in terms of cinematography, the actors, the characters, the plot, and of course do this comparison between the 52 and 37 version where appropriate. As a consequence, this review will be broken into 3 sections, the first being where I directly compare the 52 version to the 1937 version, and elaborate a little more on why I chose the 1952 over 1937. Section 2, I will talk about the characters and story specifically focusing on the 1952 version, although I may refer occasionally where appropriate back to the 37 version. And of course the third section will then be the fight scenes themselves, all 1.5 of them, after which I will conclude the video in the normal way. And so without further ado, let's get to the first section comparing the 1952 and the 1937 versions of the films. As mentioned, from the first scene to the last, it is a virtual shot-for-shot remake from the 1952 version to the 1937 version, and I shall illustrate this first with the very first scene after the opening credits finish.
Passengers will please to descend.
Papers?
Passengers will please to descend.
This way for passport examination, please. This way for passport
Special rates for the coronation.
Special high rates.
Passengers will please to descend.
Passengers will please to descend.
Inside for passport examinations, please.
What's all this nonsense about passports? Passports at the frontier, indeed.
There's some political unrest here, my dear.
Special rates for the coronation.
Special high rate.
All passports examined inside.
In both versions, we see the classic travelling over a map to represent travelling across vast distances, as we saw with the Seahawk, and as I referenced, as also seen in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Only in this case, it is not a ship or a plane, but a train which is doing the travelling, and both of these scenes are almost identical shot for shot, and the dialogue too. The 52 one is slightly quicker and snappier and has a little bit more train and a little less map, and there's a tiny bit of extraneous dialogue cut out of the 1952 version, which all in all gives a slightly more urgent pacing to the film's opening scene versus the 1937 version. And now the final scenes.
We'll meet again, Fritz.
Fate doesn't always make the right men kings.
Goodbye, Colonel. We've run a good course together.
Goodbye, Englishman. You're the finest Elfberg of them all.
We'll meet again, Fritz. Fate doesn't always make the right men kings. Goodbye, Colonel. We've run a good course together.
Goodbye, Englishman. You're the finest Elfberg of them all.
And in these scenes, again, it is virtually shot for shot identical. The dialogue is unchanged. But there is a hint here at why I chose 1952 over the 37, and that is to do with the energy level in the performances. And although I will only describe the characters briefly in this comparison section and go into far more detail in the 1952 character and plot review section, I will briefly talk about some of the actors because it's important in terms of why I chose one film over the other. And so I will now show you the scenes where we are introduced to our lead character, Rudolf Rassendyll, as he's being checked out by passport control.
Rudolf Rassendyll, British subject. Purpose of visit, pleasure. What hotel in Strelsau, Mr. Rassendyll?
I hadn't thought about it.
Huh? You better think about it. If you don't want to sleep in the park.
Well, in that case, I won't go to Strelsau until after the coronation. I've come to your country for a well-earned rest with the intention of going fishing for trout. I beg your pardon. Have I said anything I shouldn't? I know my clothes are a little conservative, but we English always dress as if we're going to a funeral when we're on a holiday.
Everything is quite in order.
Thank you for making me feel so much at home.
Rudolf Rassendyll, British subject. Object to visit, pleasure. What hotel in Strelsau, Mr. Rassendyll?
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Well, you better begin thinking if you don't want to sleep in the park. Report your address to the police within 24 hours of your arrival in the capital. That's regulations.
On second thought, I don't think I shall go to Strelsau until after the coronation. I hope that doesn't offend you, but you see, I was born with a natural distaste for crowds. And I really only came to your country to... I beg your pardon, is something the matter? Oh, of course, I know you don't dress this way in your country, but you see, we don't dress your way in England.
Luggage examination. That way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for making me feel so much at home so quickly.
When comparing the two performances side by side, the 1952 one, of course, being Stuart Granger, who we see for the second time in this series because he was also our lead hero in Scaramouche, versus Ronald Colman playing the same character, Rudolph Rassendyll, in the 1937 version, there is a definite difference in energy between the two performances. Now, I am hardly in a position to denigrate anyone for having accumulated a number of years of life and therein experience. However, Stuart Granger is only 39 when playing the character, whereas Ronald Colman is 46, and I've always felt that there was something a little creaky about his performance all the way through the film. It's a little bit slow and it's a little bit lacking in youthful vigor, which is something that Stuart Granger still manages to convey, and does so with a certain amount of wry humour. In fact, this scene, Stuart Granger's version, has a little bit more of a twinkle in the character's eye, even as he is equally as bemused and confused by what's going on as Ronald Colman's version of the character, which is played in a similar way, but seems to lack some of that wry humour behind the eyes. As I say, Ronald Colman's age shouldn't necessarily be held against him, as there are actors, of course, in their 50s who are still putting on fantastic performances as action heroes. Tom Cruise would be a good example, where he is still clearly pumping out those action hero roles, and he's well into his 50s now. That said, over the last century and into this one, the rate at which people age has changed. We are getting older more slowly, or we're remaining fitter and healthier for longer than we were at the beginning of the 20th century, for example. So 46 in 1937 is not the same as 46 in 1952, is not the same as 46 in 1980 or 46 in 2019. In short, people aged more rapidly in general the further back in time you go. And while I feel a little bad for marking down Ronald Colman's performance for a slight lack of energy, it is not to say that his performance is in any way terrible. The 1937 film is still a really good film. It just doesn't quite hit the marks that the 1952 version does. Another advantage of the 52 version starts to come through in this scene as well, which is the quality of the dialogue. The dialogue is a little bit snappier and sharper in the 52 version, whereas it's a little bit more wittery and less cleverly edited in the original 37 one. But there are other scenes where this is even more obvious, and I will show you one now.
Yes, you found it very amusing, I remember.
I'm scarcely in the position to laugh at it now.
Oh, I don't know. At least this time you'll die laughing.
Thank you.
It's no good. I can't get used to fighting with furniture. Where did you learn it?
On the playing fields of Eton.
I see now how much I missed by not going to Eton.
Nevertheless, you did them one great service.
Yes? What was that?
You didn't go to Eton.
All right, this will be your last fencing lesson. Look out for your head.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Never mind that. Touche, Rassendyll.
I cannot get used to fighting with furniture. Where'd you learn it? That all goes with the old school tie.
Well, then, here's your last fencing lesson. Look out for your head.
These scenes were, of course, the beginnings of the main sword fighting scene in this movie, and I hope not to spoil it too much, so I've cut it short and not gone into the main fight. But the opening dialogue for both fights is very similar and has the same effect in terms of starting the fight in the same way. But the 52 one is just snappier, sharper, fewer wasted words, and the phrasing when it comes to talking about fighting with furniture is just a little bit more intelligently written, with references to the playing fields of Eton. It has even a more poetic tone to it than the 37 version, which is more clunky with general references to public schooling. We also see here the character of Rupert von Hentzau, portrayed by the two actors in the two respective films. In 52, it is James Mason, and I will return to why James Mason is so excellent in the role, and my favourite character in the entire film, in more detail in the next section. Meanwhile, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. is playing the same role in the 37 version, and I know I run the risk of being called a heretic and a Philistine for suggesting that Douglas Fairbanks Jr. could possibly perform less well than any actor in a swashbuckling film. After all, it is what his father, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., and himself, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., are both famous for: acting in swashbuckling movies. However, I think the performance given by James Mason is far stronger because it is more laid back, sinister, still has a dark and worldly-wise sense of humour, but it just has a little bit more gravitas, even though his character is flippant and clearly laughing at the stupidity of the world. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. version is just a little bit too light in the performance, and you lose the sense of menace which James Mason portrays so excellently in his performance. So I will stand by my assessment that, once again, casting in this case has bumped the film up above the 37 version. And the final nail in the coffin, the 1937, if you like, is the sword fight itself. Now, I'm not going to show too much of the 1952 version of the sword fight right here, but I will show you some of the 37 sword fight as I talk about it, and I hope you can see that the sword fighting is much less ambitious. Again, seems to lack a certain amount of energy. There's a lot of close-up shots with talking where the swordplay is hidden by the closeness of the shot, so you can barely see what is going on with the arms and swords because you're close in on the actors' faces and bodies, and the swords are crowded out of the shots virtually by the framing. So on all of these counts, casting, the tightening up of the script, and the tightening up of the swordplay, these are the reasons why I have chosen the 1952 version over the 1937 version, and I hope you can appreciate why I have done so. So now we move on to the characters, focusing now specifically on the 1952 version. We have already been introduced to Rudolf Rassendyll through the earlier section, comparing the 1952 to the 1937 version, and touched upon the excellent job Stuart Granger does in portraying this character, who clearly has had some sort of unspecified experience in his life which has left him a little bit cynical when it comes to politics, royalty, and the usual deference one might expect from an English gentleman towards royalty and the class system. He makes a reference to not wanting to go to the coronation or not being particularly bothered by it and not having any particular affinity for the crown. This is left unsaid in the film. It may be elaborated on more clearly in the book. The book itself being written by Anthony Hope, as well as portraying the character of Rudolf Rassendyll with a charming, worldly wise, perhaps a little cynical, but ultimately optimistic humour. Stuart Granger also gets the opportunity to portray Prince Rudolf, soon to be Rudolf V, King of Strelsau.
Prince, where are you?
Here, Your Majesty.
Confound it, I thought you'd lost yourselves again. Who's this gentleman?
A distant relative of yours, Your Majesty.
Distant. He seems too close for comfort. That is something for which you cannot entirely blame me, Your Majesty. Oh, then who shall I blame? Well, with Your Majesty's permission, I would suggest that the blame lies equally between your great-great-great-grandfather Rudolph and my great-great-great-grandmother Amelia.
I beg your pardon? He's right, Your Majesty. The man is a Rassendyll from England.
Rassendyll? England? Yes, Your Majesty. Ever since Amelia's time, the Elfberg face has cropped out on one of us every now and then. Well met, cousin. You must forgive me if I seemed a little slow, but it's a bit early in the day to see double, even for me. Is that?
Prince Rudolph's character is a much more feckless, ill-disciplined and spoiled character, and Stuart Granger clearly has fun playing both of these roles in the film. Chief aides to Prince Rudolph and ultimately Rudolf Rassendyll, it turns out later in the film, are Colonel Zapt and Fritz von Thalenheim. Colonel Zapt played by Louis Calhern and Fritz played by Robert Coote.
It's a trick of the devil. Shave him and he'd be the king. May I ask your name, sir?
Well, since you've taken the first step in the acquaintance, gentlemen, perhaps you'd be good enough to give me a lead in the matter of names.
Oh, certainly. This is Colonel Zapt, and I'm called Fritz von Thalenheim. We are both in the service of His Majesty the King.
I'm Rudolf Rassendyll.
Both are entertaining and reasonably well-fleshed out supporting characters for our main heroes. The main love interest is Princess Flavia, played by Deborah Kerr.
I, Flavia, do become thy vassal, swearing to serve thee in truth with life and limb, until death findeth me. So help me God.
Do I kiss her? Yes.
Well, I think everything went off very well, don't you? For a coronation. I mean, that is, not that a coronation shouldn't go well, provided the king puts in an appearance suitably dressed and suitably rehearsed.
And suitably sober.
And suitably sober. Yes, I was hoping you'd notice that. By the way, among my other failings, I've rather neglected you, haven't I?
2 picture postcards in 3 years, I think.
To think that all this time you've been changing into the loveliest princess in Europe. No, the loveliest girl in Europe.
Your new responsibilities do not compel you to shower me with compliments in private, Your Majesty.
You call this private?
I'm glad you think I've changed since you last saw me. You're different, too.
Well, wouldn't anybody seem different with all this going on? I probably look like a prize idiot and talk like one, too.
You're too modest. You really looked and acted like a king today.
Oh, thank you.
It was delightfully unexpected.
Oh.
She does an excellent job of portraying this character who is initially cold towards who she thinks is Prince Rudolph. It turns out to be Rudolph Rassendil, but then grows to love him, only to realize the man she loves is not the man she thinks he is. And this covers the principal goodies in the film and brings us nicely to the baddies. Prince Michael is the principal villain in principle and is aided by his mistress Antoinette.
There. The last detail. Remember, this is to be released 20 minutes after Hensar brings you word that the coronation ceremonies have been cancelled. 20 minutes, not before.
Yes, Your Highness. And now may I offer you my congratulations?
A shade premature, but thank you, Detchard. Well, gentlemen, it's time for you to proceed to your posts. The hour is almost upon us.
We go in the cause of our country and our future sovereign.
Our future sovereign, Queen Flavia.
He looked at you when he said our future sovereign. Have you been lying to me, Michael? Is it more than the regency you want?
No, of course not. As regent, the sovereign power will be mine. That's all he meant, my dear Antoinette.
Was it? Is power all you want? I'm afraid, Michael.
For me or for yourself?
You promised to make me your wife. I want to be your wife. I want to love you and make you happy. Once you were regent, they would never let you marry me. Michael, take the happiness we can have together. Leave the power to your brother.
No. Played second fiddle to that drunken sot for the last time. Because his mother was a princess and mine was not. He lived in the royal palace. He dined with kings. Well, today the feast is set for Rudolph. But it's Michael who will sit in his place.
Prince Michael is played by Robert Douglas, while Antoinette is played by Jane Greer. And Robert Douglas's performance as Michael is quite muted, but as we're about to find out, he's competing with another villain who has a far greater stage presence and a more important role, perhaps, in the entire novel and film. This greater villain, this greater presence within the film, is of course Rupert of Hentzau, played by James Mason.
Come in.
Count Rupert of Hentzau at your service, Your Majesty. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Your Majesty.
Hentzau,
Your Highness.
your wit is as inopportune as your appearance. Why are you not at your post in the cathedral?
How can I witness the coronation of a king who will be conspicuous by his absence?
Do we want to make it obvious to the whole world that we knew he would not be there?
Incidentally, the burgomaster of Zenda is outside to pay you his respects, at the head of a delegation of loyal peasants. I told them you were probably too busy to see them, as of course you are.
There may come a time, Hentzau, when your services will no longer excuse your impertinence.
I called at your hotel again this morning, and as usual, they said you were out. Curiously enough, you were out for once. I'm glad you stopped lying to me. I hate being lied to by women. I never did before. I always lied to them.
You and I will never have anything to lie to each other about, Count Rupert.
Never? Somebody once called fidelity the fading woman's greatest weapon, the charming woman's greatest hypocrisy. And you're very charming. To anyone whose head is not bowed beneath a borrowed crown.
I thought I heard His Highness order you to your place at the cathedral.
So you're trying to put me in my place, too. I love arrogance in a woman. It's also amusing to discover that their arrogance is only a defense. But you need no defense against me. You and I are allies. Michael is plotting to betray us both. Poor Michael, how he shortchanges himself, deserting a warm, exciting woman of the world for an insipid wax doll.
He wants only to be regent.
So he's made you think he only wants to be the man behind the throne. Oh, no, he wants to sit on it. And sit on it he never can unless he sits beside the rightful queen, and that queen is not you. Even though you'll make a perfect queen. I'm glad you believed me at last. I told you we were allies. I can even help you to win him back, and I'm the only man in the country who can, because I'm the only man in the country who isn't afraid of him. All you have to do is to give him genuine cause to be jealous of me. Would that be hard?
James Mason has a very distinctive voice and a very languid, laid-back delivery, and you always wonder what exactly is going on in the mind of James Mason in any role he plays. And James Mason's voice is a large part of this. He has a very distinctive way of speaking, and so much so that it played into the comedy of Eddie Izzard. I'm talking, of course, of Eddie Izzard the comedian, back when he was funny, before he decided to first become a film actor and then attempt to try his hand in politics. But back in the day, he was hilarious, and would frequently use the voice of James Mason in various characters, usually either God or famous historical roles, as we shall see here.
Left at the traffic lights to get there. I think that's a 3 a.m. decision, that one. Where's Caesar? Of course, Caesar. Caesar. What about it? Yeah, he was a Roman leader. Yeah, small dogs are Roman leaders, aren't they? Yeah. Okay, all right, Caesar. But we'll drop the A out, right? Because it was C-E-S-A-R for some reason. I doubt Caesar was going 2,000 years ago. I have defeated Pompey. I am the first emperor of Rome. I wear the laurel wreaths with the front bit bitten out. And in 2,000 years' time, I shall be remembered as a kind of small dog food for small yapper-type dogs. And I shall be played by James Mason in the film. Yes, I shall. That's true. That's what he used to do, didn't he, James Mason? Here's Jimmy. No, he didn't. That's the line. But it would have freaked us out if it did. Ladies and gentlemen, James Mason. What are you doing, James? Sorry, forget all that bit. We'll cut that out. Well, we are the Romans. I am legionary. This is our leader, Mr. Dog. Mr. Dog, they're saying, yes, I am. A word with you, legionary, if I may. Thinking of changing the name, I am, at the moment. Changing from Mr. Dog to Caesar. I think I could had a word with the marketing department. The marketing department of Rome, and there's Mr. Caesar, you know. Oh, I'm getting off this seesaw, it's boring. Bring me my horse, thank you very much. There we go, that's much better. Have we got steel radials on the back of these?
Ah, classic Eddie Izzard. Anyway, James Mason has obviously played a variety of roles over the years and has always had a very strong ability to portray characters with a wide range of personalities and also bring out subtleties and nuances in almost any performance that he's managed to play. Hence the multi-layered, multifaceted rendition of Rupert of Hentzau, where he is charming on one level because he is intelligent and witty and makes fun of the world and people in it, but simultaneously is sinister because he clearly has no scruples about killing, as he discusses how he would have preferred to have poisoned Prince Rudolph outright rather than just sending him to sleep with a potion.
Find out who betrayed us.
If only he'd drunk what I wanted to put in that bottle.
And the relatively offhand way in which he finally kills his employer, Prince Michael. But we shall see more of this when I cover the plot and the story in more detail. As I mentioned earlier, although the character of Rupert of Hentzau is a villain, he's undoubtedly the most interesting character in the story, the perfect anti-hero in the most literal sense of the words. Perhaps the best scene that encapsulates the character is the vanity he displays so cockily in front of the mirror as he adjusts his helmet, whistling a jaunty tune to himself. I'm not alone in thinking that he is the most interesting character, since the author himself, Anthony Hope, wrote a sequel to The Prisoner of Zenda entitled Rupert of Hentzau, and these two books of the apparently considerable output of Anthony Hope are the only two which are generally remembered by people, although Rupert of Hentzau to a lesser degree. The Prisoner of Zenda is by far the most famous book he wrote. As I summarise now some elements of the plot, you will see again how important Rupert of Hentzau's character is in carrying the story forward. After Prince Rudolph is kidnapped, Rudolph Rassendyll then pretends to be Prince Rudolph under the guidance of Colonel Zapt and Fritz. All the while, they simultaneously are searching to try and discover the hiding place of the captured Prince Rupert. On two occasions, Rupert of Hentzau is sent by Prince Michael to try and trap, or more precisely kill, the pretender, Rudolph Rassendyll. Firstly here.
How will I know it isn't another trap of Michael's?
The man I send you will have the mate to this. Now go, and go quickly.
And you?
Michael finds out what I've done. You and I will not meet again.
Good luck. In everything.
To you, with the princess. They've come. They're too soon.
Mr. Rassendyll? Mr. Rassendyll, forgive me if I interrupt you at an inopportune moment, but I'd like a friendly word with you. I'm alone and unarmed.
It's Rupert of Hentzau. Don't trust him.
You can talk with the door between us, Count Hentzau.
Will you give me your word not to fire while we talk?
I'll give you my word not to fire before you do. To say what you have to say from where you are.
As you please. A truce while I offer peace terms. £50,000 in English notes and safe conduct to the frontier.
That sounds fair enough.
Well, you accept?
Give me a moment to think it over. Get out of the line of fire.
Yes.
Count Hentzau!
Majesty.
I hold you to your word and accept your offer.
Congratulations. The money's in my pocket and there's a good horse waiting for you. Come out.
I prefer you to come in. It's less public. Do you mind?
Not at all.
Careful. He'll shoot first.
What, after he's given his word? In England, that simply isn't done. Open it. What, when there's 3 against 1? All right, I'll open it myself.
this scene, although Antoinette was sent to bait the trap, she is in fact seeking to help Rudolf Rassendyll because although she loves and supports Prince Michael, she fears his plan, if successful, will mean that they will never be married because he will end up marrying Princess Flavia and grabbing the crown for himself. So she's decided to try and help Rudolf Rassendyll, but only if he agrees to spare the life of Prince Michael and essentially allow them to have a happy life together, Antoinette and Prince Michael together. Again, in the scene, we see Stuart Granger's considerable skill as a physical actor on display as he leaps around from roof to tree in his bid to escape Rupert and his men. The second trap is more subtle, as Rupert is sent to treat with Rudolf Rassendyll and Colonel Zapt and Fritz more openly. But of course, it's never that simple.
Ah, the play actor in person.
Henshaw.
Your Majesty, I bring you your brother's humble greetings and his hope that you enjoy the boar hunting here in Zenda, and his respect, of course, to your two principal boars.
Well, what price the crown today? The last offer was £50,000. Do I hear perhaps 52,000?
You'd hear a much better offer than that, in private.
Oh, before we go any further, I must tell you that I'm prepared to give you a chance to escape your thoroughly well-deserved end on the condition that you yourself return the prisoner of Zenda to me alive.
Really, Mr. Rassendyll, do you seriously expect me to believe that you, of all people, want the king back? You insult my intelligence.
I see. Well, then you've come a very long way for nothing.
I hope not, for Michael's sake.
Oh, you brought another of his generous ultimatums.
I have. He doubles his offer, £100,000. I thought it would amuse you. The fact is, between ourselves, Michael doesn't understand a gentleman.
You and I, we do, don't we?
Rassendyll, you're a man after my own heart. Frankly, you and I are the only two people worth saving in this whole affair, now aren't we? This is my plan for us. Now listen. Attack the castle boldly. Get your friends right at the head. There's bound to be a little rifle play at first.
Oh, unavoidable.
Arrange the time with me.
I have such confidence in you, of course.
Michael will fall. The king will already have moved on to a happier life in the next world. And your friends, if they fall too, you and I, Rupert of Hentzau, and you, king of the realm, will be the only two left who know the truth.
And don't you think we're being perhaps just a little drastic with Michael?
Perhaps a little, but I make it a point never to trust a jealous man, don't you?
Michael jealous?
You know the lady, I think.
Oh, in the summer house. Yeah. But surely no woman in her right senses will prefer the Duke to you.
Women are never in their right senses, thank goodness.
So you're doing all this for love. How romantic.
Well, love and, Your Majesty's gratitude throughout your long and happy reign. And then, of course, you might turn over to me Michael's castles and estates.
Oh, yes, of course. We mustn't lose sight of those. You never know whose hands they might fall into.
Look what I offer you, the throne and the princess. You were planning on them anyway, but this way it's sure. Shall we shake hands on it?
Hey, Zap, Fritz, listen to this. Count Hentzau offers me the throne. That is, if you two don't mind being killed.
Their turn comes later, play actor. Yours comes now.
Guard! Stop that man!
The final few seconds of the scene where Rupert Caesar attempts to sway and convert Rudolf Rassendyll to his way of thinking have failed gives Stuart Granger the opportunity to, in a fraction of a second of expression and physical movement, show his shock at his near-death experience, with the dagger mere millimeters from his face. However, all these traps come to naught, and eventually the prince is rescued, and during the rescue, Prince Michael is in fact killed by Rupert of Hentzau. Once again, Rupert of Hentzau, a prime mover in the narrative. And in the end, after the fight, Rupert moment of Hentzau actually escapes, but I'll cover that in more detail in a moment as I go through the fight. Finally, with the prince rescued and now essentially king because Rudolf Rassendyll was crowned in his place, so he simply takes the place of Rudolf Rassendyll and adopts his rightful place as king of Strelsau, all of the plots and all of the deception is finally revealed to Flavia.
I sent for you to thank you for the service you have done this kingdom and its king. No one can know better than myself how conscientiously you have played your role.
I love you. With my whole heart and soul, I love you. In all else, I've been an imposter, but not in that. From the first moment I saw you in the cathedral, I knew you were the only woman in the world for me. As I stand here now, I know there never can be any other.
It would have made no difference if I'd known. It was always you, never the king. Is it true that you're going home to England?
Tonight. Come with me. I won't let them stand in the way of our happiness. Come with me.
Oh, if only I could.
Oh, my darling, there's a world outside. Our world. And think you'll be free. Free of these cares and duties. Free to live as joyously and happy. What is it, Flavia?
I was born to these cares and duties, Rudolph. Help me to do what I was born to. Help me to do what I must.
How can I, my darling? I love you.
But is love the only thing? If love were all, I could follow you in rags to the end of the world. But if love were all, you would have left the king to die in his cell. Honor binds a woman too, Rudolph. And my honor lies in keeping faith with my country and my house. I don't know why God has let me love you. But I know that I must stay.
Never to see you again. Never to hold you. Never... My darling.
Your heart will always be in my heart. And the touch of your lips on mine.
This is a heart-rending scene, even if it can be difficult to understand some of the motivations and emotions driving the characters from a modern-day perspective. Rudolf Rassendyll obviously wants Flavia to come with him, and Flavia, obviously in her heart, wants to go with Rudolf Rassendyll. However, she feels duty-bound to remain and play her part as Queen of Strelsau at the side of King Rudolf V. And in spite of Rudolf Rassendyll's desperate pleas to her initially to come with him, he relents and supports her actions in staying with King Rudolf, however reluctantly. As I say, it may be difficult to empathise with characters putting an idea of honour and duty above love, and indeed, even I personally would see little attraction in placing abstract concepts such as political leadership, power, being a figurehead, above such personal and real emotions as love itself. However, even if these concepts of monarchy, power and politics have little or a reduced sway in terms of duty and honour or an emotional motivator from a modern perspective, although this is not entirely true, I'm sure, for everyone, I think everyone can imagine what it is like, or has been in such a position where they've had to put their own emotions aside for the sake of something, or even perhaps more likely someone, for their good, and have placed your own emotions at a lower level of importance. I hope and think we can all imagine what that must feel like, and feel the pain of Rudolf Rassendyll and Princess Flavia. And now on to the fights. The first fight scene barely counts as a sword fight. I mean, there is a sword involved, but it is just the one sword, and is mostly a wrestling match between Rudolf Rassendyll and one of the guards, while Prince Rudolf, in a weakened state because of his previous drugging incident, can barely raise his head to watch and offer the odd mumbled word of support.
I'll help you. Just leave off.
So, this minor tussle out of the way, we now approach the main sword fight of the entire film, and the reason why this is at number 2 in the best sword fighting films of all time.
Yes, you found it very amusing, I remember.
I'm scarcely in the position to laugh at it now.
Oh, I don't know. At least this time you'll die laughing.
Thank you.
It's no good. I can't get used to fighting with furniture. Where did you learn it?
On the playing fields of Eton.
I see now how much I missed by not going to Eton.
Nevertheless, you did them one great service.
Yes? What was that?
You didn't go to Eton.
All right, this will be your last fencing lesson. Look out for your head. Why don't you stand your ground and fight?
He who fights and runs away, remember?
So you want to try and get to the drawbridge? I just killed a man for trying that.
An unarmed man, of course.
Of course. beginning to sound too much like the playing fields of Eton. I'll return to fight another day, too. Goodbye, play actor.
Beyond the witty back and forth in the dialogue between Rupert of Hentzau and Rudolf Rassendyll, which already elevates this to one of the greatest sword fights in films, in my opinion, the fighting itself is incredibly powerful and moving in terms of its realism, but also drama, woven together expertly, in this case choreographed by Gene Heremans. This fight stands in a rare category of fights which tends to influence or bleed into my fencing, but it did so even before I started this series of films and rewatched several fight scenes which then immediately influenced my fencing thereafter. I had already been using the fight scene in The Prisoner of Zenda in my head whenever I wasn't in the mood to fence or fence competitively. I would imagine that I was in this final fight scene from The Prisoner of Zenda, and it would put me in exactly the right mood to fence with fun but vigor and a certain sense of seriousness in terms of desire to win and not be killed in quotes really. And this is doubly odd because my weapon is épée and this is saber. That said, my coach Ákos Molovany was first and foremost a saber fencer, although he was an expert in all three weapons and obviously taught me all three to a certain degree and then specialized in épée with me. But there is something very reminiscent about this fight to his style of fencing. Now, these are proper weighted sabers of the latter part or end of the 19th century going into the 20th century, and while they may be lighter than, say, sabers of 100 years earlier, they are still weighty weapons, and the fight scene reflects that. They move like sabers, or are pretty fast for proper military sabers. But some of the moves and some of the actions do remind me of some of the more flamboyant actions that Ákos would teach on occasion, normally for fun or for historical context. Remembering, of course, that Ákos was teaching sword fighting and fencing in the Hungarian army between the wars and probably into and through the Second World War, and so was not that far removed in time from the very saber fighting we see in this film, being 30 to 40 years earlier at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And as I just said, you can see many fencing-inspired moves in this fight. One point in particular which always catches me and makes me lean forward out of my seat, or indeed attempt to avoid the blow on occasions, is where James Mason makes a nice saber cut to Rassendyll's head, which is parried, but then he attempts to push through and continue to the head. It is so much like a continuation in fencing, and of course in this case in pure earnest, it being in a real fight, that it really does make your heart jump for a second in terms of the realism and the actual sense of danger initiated by this move. While on occasion both actors' feet move out of position, they don't hold a proper fencing position throughout the entire fight. Again, this actually lends realism to the fight, as in a desperate fight where they're moving around the room, they wouldn't always be able to land their feet in a perfect fencing pose. Similarly, as the fight progresses, it actually slows down a little and becomes a little more wild, which again, whether by accident or design, serves to reinforce the idea that this is a fight in earnest and they are getting tired. These are heavy weapons being thrown around, and although it was very fast and crisp to begin with, it becomes increasingly obviously made with more and more effort as their arms become weighted down with fatigue. And finally, this may well be the fight scene in which Stuart Granger accidentally got a sword in the mouth.
Zenda, do you have many mishaps doing that? Many a sword?
Well, yeah, I got a sword in the mouth for that.
Which led to a very disturbing, worrying and impressive amount of blood coming out of his mouth, even though, in fact, the blade had only just sort of cut the side of his gum in a minor way. It just happened to bleed very profusely. And so we've come to the end of our review of The Prisoner of Zenda, the 1952 version. And although there are aspects which could have suffered greater and more in-depth coverage, such as, for example, the soundtrack, which is also a pretty awesome and stirring piece of music, I think I have successfully covered enough information to prove that this should be number 2 in my top 10 best sword fighting films of all time. What with the story itself, an adventure, but with a romance at its heart, with a bittersweet ending, dashing heroes, treacherous and yet charming villains, and lovers either trapped by fate to ultimately betray their love or trapped by duty to ultimately spurn them. And all this combined with one of the greatest sword fighting scenes ever. There is nothing much more I can add to that. And so, I hope you enjoyed this number 2 in the series of the best sword fighting films of all time, and I hope you will join me in number 1 in the best sword fighting films of all time. Take care.